Dag allemaal, hartelijk welkom bij deze online avond in tweede in onze serie over Power BI External Tools. Vandaag hebben we Christian Wade te gast. Hij gaat ons alles vertellen over de ALM Toolkit. En dat zal ongeveer een half uurtje in beslag nemen. Daarna heeft hij nog een half uur de tijd voor vragen van ons over Power BI, maar dus ook over tabular models, Analysis Services, SQL Server Analysis Services of in Azure, premium of niet, not premium. Dus vragen kun je stellen in de chat window, de Q&A window moet ik zeggen. En de beste vragen sturen wij door naar Christian. Dus wens jullie veel plezier. En Christian, may I hand over the word to you?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much indeed, Edgar. Hello, everybody. I'm very happy to be here talking to you. I don't know if you can see me right now. If you can, welcome to my home. Maybe one day, we might meet in person. So let's see. I'm going to go ahead and share my desktop. Okay. So I'm going to start off with a couple of slides. I assume you can see my desktop here. So I'm a program management lead at Microsoft for Analysis Services and the Analysis Services functionality in Power BI, primarily Power BI Premium. So for that kind of semantic modeling functionality, my team and I focus on that. You may have seen a lot of the Analysis Services features show up in Power BI, and I built ALM Toolkit, the predecessor to ALM Toolkit a long time ago. In fact, I think I've got a slide of it here. Many years ago in my spare time, just like as a hobby, and it's an analysis services tool. And it runs in Visual Studio. It works with, SSDT projects, and it's actually the same build and code base as ALM Toolkit. So when I fix a bug in one, it fixes it in both. And so I built this a long time ago. And then I decided to make a kind of Power BI centric version of it. And so many Power BI users don't use Visual Studio. So it's a standalone installation. But again, the logic behind it is exactly the same. It shares the same DLL. It's the same build. And so the difference here is that Microsoft were kind enough to build this grid, which on the BISM normalizer version, it's a WinForms grid, whereas this in ALM Toolkit, it's actually a TypeScript grid. So we could host it in the browser one day. It's actually the same diff control that's what's known as the Monaco set of controls that is often used by Visual Studio Code. And so this is more of a modern version of the grid than what you get in BISM Normalizer. Since BISM Normalizer is a Visual Studio extension, there are extra challenges to running this type of, this actually runs in Chromium, just like with Power BI Desktop in the report view. Power BI Desktop has its own local Chromium instance running, which is why it's exactly the same code base you see in the report view as what you see in the browser, because Power BI Desktop is running a local Chromium instance. And actually the new modeling view is also TypeScript hosted in Chromium. So one day in the not too distant future, you will see the modeling view in Power BI Desktop show up in the browser as well for that very reason. And so this is also running in Chromium. This is why the installer of ALM Toolkit is like 200 and something megabytes, whereas the BISM Normalizer one is like 1 or 2 megabytes or something. I can't remember exactly. But the point being that ALM Toolkit installs a Chromium instance, and this is a TypeScript control. And then, as I say, it doesn't run in Visual Studio, but other than that, it's actually the same code base, and it actually works with Analysis Services as well. Okay, so the types of things that you can do with it. I mean, people use it for many different things. Some of them I've never even imagined. I find out people using it for things that I hadn't even imagined every now and then. But if you think about it, there's a lot of, especially with Power BI, it's kind of like, we call it self-service BI, we call it low code, no code. There's some movement in other areas outside BI for this kind of no code, low code movement. And so Power BI is very much in that vein. It enables users to just click and drag and drop and be productive without needing to be very in depth in code. And it enables that kind of scenario, kind of like deployment pipelines in Power BI. I don't know if you've seen deployment pipelines in Power BI. It's a very visual guided experience. You get a diff script. You get to see what data sets, reports, and dashboards, and soon RDL files and other artifacts are in your development, your test, and your production environment. And then you can see which ones have been added, which ones have been updated, and which ones have been removed. You can pick and choose which ones you want to deploy across environments, and it's got validation to make sure that you don't, dig a hole for yourself. It doesn't let you, for example, deploy a report that depends on a data set that you chose not to deploy. It'll do the full analysis of the dependency tree, and it therefore gives you a very visual, very guided kind of low code, no code experience. So ALM Toolkit is very much in the same vein. It's also similar to Schema Compare, that is a mature area for relational databases. We've got Schema Compare in SSDT. There's other tools like Redgate SQL Compare, which I think now ships in Visual Studio. A baseline version of Redgate ships in Visual Studio now, and so SQL Compare is used sometimes for deployment of a new version of a data warehouse. Or that you obviously don't want to. You just want to deploy the new version of the schema. You don't want to reload all the historical data. Same with a transactional database, right? You just want to bring the schema up to the latest version. And so it's very much in the same vein as that. I will say that actually the guidelines, the guardrails on ALM Toolkit are probably stronger than what you get in some of the relational schema compare tools. A lot of them will let you, generate a diff script, like a SQL script that will, for example, add a new column that is non-nullable to a table that has data and then give you an error. The idea with ALM Toolkit and Business Normalizer is that you should never get an error when you apply the changes, right? Whether you script them out or you apply them in the tool, you should, it's not, in 99% of the cases, and the goal is to be 100% of the cases, you should never get an error. So it would never let you, for example, create a new relationship that points to a column that doesn't exist or something. That's just a very simple example, right? So it's a guided visual experience for deployment across environments. So you can use it for that. You can use it for things like for incremental refresh is a very common use case now, where you want to deploy, some new measures or changes to a measures, and the version of your data set in the service may have like billions of rows using incremental refresh and large models. And so if you publish from Power BI Desktop, you will lose all of the historical data and you need to wait hours to refresh it. With this, you can just deploy just the changes to the measures only. You can use it, and then even for traditional kind of deployment scenarios, which may be more automated, may be more integrated with source control systems, things like CI/CD in DevOps and TFS traditionally. So even in those scenarios, right, you may not be doing the deployment itself in a visual guided way, but then you still need to have all of these branches of the code base, right? Whether you've got multiple developers working and on different repos, or a very common one is, you need to have bug fixes for your production environment. And to do a full deployment across development, test, and UAT and production takes a long time. There may, and quite often these traditional deployment methodologies are kind of like an all or nothing deployment, right? And so for these complex semantic models, you may have hundreds of objects in there, or even thousands of objects. And a lot of it may not be ready to deploy. You may be in your development environment, you're not ready to deploy that, or there may be objects in your test environment, in your UAT environment that haven't been signed off by the users yet. So you can't go through a full deployment process, which only happens periodically. So therefore, you need to do bug fixes on a bug fix branch or something like that. Well, when you do a bug fix there, you need to merge the changes back to the main branch without reinventing the wheel. You don't want to do the same fix twice, right? So it's useful for all of those types of scenarios, for the traditional kind of enterprise deployment scenarios, as well as the kind of low code, no code experiences, right? And so the key here is, you know, if you're going to, for example, do a diff and merge across repos, and let's say you've got the BIM file from Analysis Services, it's not as simple as just doing a JSON merge in Visual Studio Code, right? You know, there are a ton of interdependencies between the tabular model objects. Like, you know, a very simple one, again, is just a relationship that relates to a column that doesn't exist. That's the tip of the iceberg. I mean, most of the code behind this tool is validation code to make sure that the integrity of the target model is not compromised. It is nowhere near as simple as just doing a JSON merge. For anything more than just adding a simple measure or something like that, it gets pretty difficult pretty quickly if you're just doing JSON merges on the metadata, right? And there's some other use cases. Those are the kind of predominant use cases for it. There are some other ones as well. You know, if you've got multiple, you know, I've seen customers maybe with a big data warehouse, and they've got separate tabular models for each subject area, and there may be some conformed dimensions that are shared across each of the tabular models. You don't want to have to recreate those. It could even be some metric tables and some other definitions. They don't want to have to redefine those definitions across all of the tabular models. And if you want to, and you can use it kind of like for master metadata management. You know, you deploy and you want to do a change to your conformed customer dimension. You do it in one model and you replicate that change to the other models without having to do it manually, right? So there are some scenarios like that. It's somewhat similar to composite models. The new version of composite models we're going to ship at the end of the year, but composite models we're going to ship at the end of the year is more for the analyst scenario, the analyst use case. Whereas if you've got an enterprise model that is owned and managed by IT, you may use the composite models for some scenarios, but in most cases you want to store all the data locally for improved performance rather than doing joins across large models at runtime. So therefore you would want to replicate the metadata and then refresh that data so that you get local models. So there are lots of different use cases for it, right? You can automate it, you can incorporate it into builds, you can be very fine-grained. Like the Analysis Services deployment wizard is an all or nothing deployment based on some policies. Like you can say retain partitions or whatever. But here you can go into the individual objects. As I want to say, for this table, I never want to touch it. For this table, or this role, I never want to touch it. This other role, I do, depending on the environment. It's very fine-grained in terms of the parameterization for automation. But honestly, most of the use cases for it are kind of in the top half of this slide. All right. Okay. Oh, and one last thing is, like, it says bridge the gap between self-service and corporate BI. Let's talk about that for a minute. There's lots of different use cases here, right? There's just prototyping, right? We used to get this from back in the day. People would prototype in Power Pivot and then do import from Power Pivot into Analysis Services, right? Then we did import from Power BI Desktop in the Azure Analysis Services web designer. We had to remove that for reasons I'm not going to go into right now. And it never actually worked very well. There were a ton of issues with it, but I will tell you, it was very, very popular. So, you know, a lot of people look at this, I'm going to bridge the gap between self-service and corporate BI, and they think, well, how's that ever going to work? Like, corporate BI goes through so much extra rigor in terms of data definitions and, documentation of source to target mappings and alignment with corporate naming standards and, just all of the extra rigor that is implied by corporate BI, but there is definitely a use case for this. We've seen it time and again in terms of usage. A lot of the time you might bring in data either from an analyst model or from a prototype, and you can use that as a starting point. You then, in your development environment only, you can use it as a starting point. You can harvest certain objects and you can iterate on it, and it will more likely speed up the process of harvesting other objects, and it will more likely retain the essence of the original intent of that object, of that model, if that makes sense. Okay, so with that, let's see. So to use it in Power BI, you need to obviously download the installer, and you need to enable the XMLA endpoint, which you can do in the capacity settings in Power BI Premium. And this gives you backwards compatibility with the Analysis Services tools and processes, including ALM Toolkit and BISM Normalizer, right? So there's a whole ecosystem of developers and partners and tools and processes and that has been built up over multiple decades for analysis services that Power BI is inheriting, because Power BI is very close to being a true superset of analysis services now. So you just need to enable the XML endpoint in order to use this tool with Power BI datasets in the service. And then to use it, I mean, there is a lot of kind of complexity that is abstracted from the users. There's a lot of complex things that it does in the background, but to use it, it's actually quite a simple tool. There's just a handful of buttons on there. There's a handful of kind of policies that you can enforce. If you go and look at this page of how to use it, this covers the majority of what you need to know. So it's a pretty straightforward tool to use. So with that, I'm going to pause here for a minute and see if there's any questions in the chat window before I jump into a demo.
Yes, we have a few questions, Christian.
Yes.
One question is, does this also work for Power BI Pro?
Okay, so today it does not work with Power BI Pro purely because it requires the XML endpoint, which is a premium only feature. So there's actually technical reasons on why we cannot enable, one day we may enable read-only access through, you can use the XML endpoint for multiple things. You can use it for read-only access so that users can, connect through even non-Microsoft data visualization tools. We could technically enable that in Pro. For write access, there's some significant architectural work we'd have to do to enable it for write access. I'm not saying we'll never do it, but certainly today it doesn't work. It's a premium only feature. But with Premium Gen 2 and Premium per user, it will work with Premium per user, right? So if you have Pro licenses, there's an incremental upgrade cost. You don't need to pay the full price of a Premium per user license. There's an incremental upgrade cost to get from Pro to Premium per user. I know the pricing hasn't been announced yet, but that's probably the best answer I can give you right now for that scenario is to consider Premium per user.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay.
Okay. And there's also a question from Riga, and he says, how much support ALM Toolkit, does it support also managing Power BI data flows?
Yeah, okay, so thank you. So no, it doesn't. So it really is focused purely on the analysis services engine that is running behind the dataset in Power BI. It doesn't cover data flows. It doesn't cover paginated reports or regular reports or dashboards or that type of thing. So if the best answer I can tell you for that is to look at deployment pipelines. That will at some point in the not too distant future cover all of the Power BI artifacts like data flows and paginated reports. But yeah, this tool is just for the analysis services engine that's running in Power BI, so it's therefore just for the data set.
Okay, thank you very much. You can continue.
Great, thank you. So I have this model. So let's say I'm a BI pro in my organization. I built this model. It has incremental refresh defined on it, right? So the version that I have here in Power BI Desktop is just a sample of the data. I don't have the local resources to have billions and billions of rows, right? The version in the service, I can use the large models feature, right? And with incremental refresh and the large models feature, I invoke a refresh in the service, and it can grow up to like maybe 70 gigabytes with 3 billion rows or whatever, right? So the version in the service, let's say I've got many users using it and there are billions of rows and it's already out there, right? And I want to add some enhancements to it. I might be using Tablet Editor to add calculation groups and translations and things like that, right? So now I want to deploy a new version of this data set, right? So this is just one of the use cases in that slide, right? There's many, this is one of the most common ones at the moment, but there are many other use cases. So I want to deploy a new version of this data set, right? So then I come up to publish and ignore this. This is because I'm running on a private build and I'm on the Microsoft environment. So now I select the workspace and then it asks me, do I want to replace the data set? And I don't want to replace the data set because this published flow in Power BI Desktop will take my local data set and replace the data set in the service. So therefore, this little data set that is like 2 megabytes big is going to replace my 70 gigabyte one, right? And then I invoke a refresh and it might take 3 hours because it's going to reload all of that historical data. I don't want to do that. I just want to deploy the calculation group and the translations, which is just a metadata only operation. It should be pretty much instant, or just like deploying new measures. I don't want to wait hours to reload all of the data, right? So what I'm going to do, I'm going to click on this view impact, right? And it's going to take me up to the service. And so I just want to show you how to get the endpoint. So it's taken me up to the lineage view here in the Power BI service. I can see all of the interdependencies between the Power BI objects, right? And I'm going to come here to, this tells me actually who's using. So I'm doing this deployment. I could want to notify my downstream users of the reports. I could have reports in lots of different workspaces. I could notify them all them about I'm about to do a deployment to tell them about the new features that are going to be included, for example. And so what I'm going to do, I'm going to come into settings and I'm going to come over to premium, and I'm going to copy this workspace connection. So this workspace connection is what I can use in place of the Analysis Services server name, right? And in order to do this, I need to, in order to do write updates to the data sets based on this workspace connection, I need to enable the XMLA endpoint in the capacity. This basically means that the XMLA, this basically uses the XMLA endpoint, and I can connect to the Power BI workspace as if it was an Analysis Services server, right? From SSMS, from SSDT, from Tabular Editor, from DAX Studio, from ALM Toolkit, and many other tools. I can do PowerShell scripts and automation and automated deployments and everything, all using this workspace connection as if it was an Analysis Services server, right? So with that, I've copied that into the clipboard, and by the way, we're just adding this. This is going to be the large models. This is going to ship. I believe by the end of this calendar year. This will let you specify the default storage format for large models on a workspace. I'm going off on a tangent there. So I've just copied the workspace connection, right? So now I'm going to switch back over to Power BI Desktop, and instead of publishing it this way, I'm going to switch over to External Tools ribbon, right? That Daniel Otake built as part of the Power BI Contributor program. And it's taken off virally, as you can see. Mike Carlo has got an installer that installs all of these tools that the community has put together, which is great. And as you can see, we ran out of space on the ribbon, and it's not even a GA feature yet, right? I mean, it's taking off pretty virally. And so I'm going to go ahead and open up ALM Toolkit. So just like that Studio and Tabular Editor, it's immediately connected with the source for my comparison being the Power BI Desktop Game Revenue 2, right, which is listed here, right? And it actually lists the SSDT projects as well, but I won't go there now. You can also happen to have SSDT open, which is why it listed those. It also, you can have the source be a data set or a file. So the source can be a BIM file or a PBIT file, right? And that works fine, right? That works pretty well. Now, and the target in this case is that same workspace URL, that same workspace connection that we saw in the service for the XML endpoint. It's already there, so I don't need to enter it again, but it's the same thing, right? And in fact, if I click on this, it's going to go ahead and connect, and then you'll see the same data sets listed there as what we saw in the Power BI service. Right. We'll just let this connect. And so there you go. I've got a load of junk in this workspace, right? Now, and you know, to make the target a Power BI Desktop, normally you wouldn't do that because today, just like with Tabular Editor, there's certainly only certain metadata operations that you can edit in the data set in behind Power BI Desktop, because so just like with Tabular Editor, you can only do calculation groups, perspectives, measures and translations, we're this close to translations. So today you wouldn't normally do this, but you can certainly dump the output into a file or like I said, a PBIT or a BIM file. But in this case, I'll keep it as the data set, right? And now I'll perform my comparison. So it's going to do just like with schema diff, or just like with deployment pipelines, it's going to list all of the objects. And some of the objects are exactly the same as what they were before, right? Like this currency table is shown here, and there's no difference. There's no action that I can do other than skip it, right? It's exactly the same in the source and the target. So this is that monocode diff control that is part of the controls that Visual Studio Code uses. This is all running in Chromium right here, which is different to the BISM normalizer version that I happen to have here. This is all WinForms, right? Whereas the version here is Chromium that could be hosted in a browser. And so what I'm going to do is, so actually here, I can see, for example, that some of the objects are different, right? So they can either be, they can either have different definitions, same definition, missing in target or missing in source, right? So in this case, I've got a different definition on this game table because this is the one with the incremental refresh policy defined on it. So the version in the target has got a ton of partitions, right? Because maybe it's got billions of rows. And so what I want to do is I want to push my calculation group and translations, and I don't want to lose those partitions, right? So even as a metadata only deployment, I need to retain these partitions. Now, in some cases, I may even want to update the table if I'm changing a data type or even deleting a column. I can delete a column and still retain the partitions, right? And to do that, there's a ton of options here. So this lets me, for table updates, retain the refresh policy based partition. So I could actually apply the changes to this table and keep those partitions. And there's a ton of other options here, like just ignore roles, ignore cultures, perspectives, merge cultures, perspectives. There's a ton of different options here, as well as the refresh option. So in this case, I'm just going to do a recalc. I'm not going to pull any data from the source. I'm just going to do a recalc to ensure that it's queryable. So I'll leave that alone. And so for whatever reason, I don't want to update the game table. So I could update it and retain the partitions, or I can just go ahead and skip it, right? I can skip it this way. And now we're not going to touch that table, right? And so what I'm going to do also is I'm going to hide skip objects with same definitions. So this lets us view only the objects that are different, right? So I've got this calculation group that you can see. I want to create this calculation group in the target. This is the calculation item, right? And I've got a ton of other options that are either going to be created or updated or deleted. And so in this case, for example, when we are harvesting objects from a prototype or from one model to another, or for conform dimension scenarios or anything like that, quite often there'll be many objects in the target model that I don't want to mess with, that I want to retain. So I would have to come in and I would have to skip all of these delete action items, right? And I could skip them all one by one, or I can multi-select and skip them, but there could be hundreds of them there. And I may not want to mess with any of them if I'm just harvesting objects from one model to another. So what I'm going to do is, if I do back to delete here, so what I can do in that scenario is I can say skip all objects missing in source, and then all of the deletes get skipped in one go, even if there's hundreds of them, right? So that what I want to do in this particular case, for whatever reason, I'm not ready to deploy these measures either, so I'm just going to skip them. So it's a very visual. I may be working on them in my development environment. They still need some more work. I can pick and choose what I want to deploy. I can be very responsive to my users' needs. I can deploy bug fixes more easily. I get this like controlled diff and merge where I can just pick and choose what I want to diff and merge, right? So now I've only got the so now I'm gonna say instead of hide skip objects with same definition, I'm gonna say just hide skip objects. So now I'm looking at just the items that I'm gonna actually affect right now. And so I've got the calculation group and I've got these cultures with translations. So I can go ahead and validate the selection. So this is where it's going to perform a validation. Just like I said earlier, a lot of the relational schema compare tools, they let you create a column that's non-nullable with no data and give you an error when you apply the script, right? Whereas here, it's going to do a validation, and the goal here is that you should never get an error, right? So for example, if I have a relationship that refers to a column that doesn't exist, if I have name collisions, if I have a table with an M expression that gets data from another M expression that doesn't exist, all of these interdependencies, and really I'm just touching the tip of the iceberg, but all of these interdependencies are validated, right? So for example, if I were to say, discourage implicit measures is a requirement for the calculation group, right? So let's say I didn't know that and I just skipped it, right? Rather than letting me deploy this calculation group, knowing that it would error when I could go ahead and script it and hand it to a DBA or something, and knowing that it would compromise the integrity of the target model, what it will do instead is it will successfully validate, but it will say, you know, I'm going to create the translations, but I'm not going to let you create this calculation group because it depends on discourage implicit measures, which needs to be set to true, and it's not in the target model because I skipped it, right? And because I wasn't able to create the calculation group, I wasn't able to create the calculation items either, right? So it does a full analysis of the kind of dependency tree, right? To as a kind of guardrail to make sure that you don't do anything that doesn't make sense. So I'm going to go ahead and update this again, and now I'll validate again. And we're now back in a situation where we've got no warnings, right? And at this point, I can go ahead and update the model in the target, which I'll do in a second. I can also generate a script. So I can store this as an XML file that can be run. You know, it will be a Timsel create or replace script that I can run in SQL Server Management Studio, right? So I can generate a script to run later or to hand it to a DBA or whatever. Or I can report the differences. I won't run this now, but I can just save the state. A lot of users use this. I've heard even users using it just to check what is the state of all of the different environments because they forgot, right? So anyway, so I'm going to go ahead and just update the target. So that will push the calculation group and the translations, but not everything else, right? It's not going to delete that table. It's not going to update the game table. It's not going to update the partitions. It's not going to create and update those measures. It's just going to push the calculation group, and it's going to push the translations, and it's just going to do a process recalc, right? Based on the options that I had. If I wanted to refresh tables, I could just do the affected tables. It's very fine grained, gives you a lot of control. So having done that, I'm going to refresh the comparison, and we will see that everything that I push now has the same definition, right? So this calculation group you can see is now the same in the source and target, and it has the same definition, and I can't do anything but skip it. And the other items that I skipped are all still different, right? They're either missing in target, different definition, and they're also skipped. The reason the translations one is not is because there are some measures it wasn't able to push from the translations because they're in a different table with the same name. It does what it can, and then if it can't, it's not. I had the option to merge the translation, so then it reruns the analysis and it says it's still different. So that's by design, right? But the point being that whatever I chose to skip is still different. So here's the game table. We didn't touch the partitions. It's all still different, and the skip items are still remembered. And what I can even do now is I can go ahead and save this, right? So I can save this comparison. So I'm going to put it here in my downloads folder, and I can save this comparison. And I'm going to close ALM Toolkit, and I'm going to reopen ALM Toolkit from that same file that I just created a second ago. Right? And it's going to, based off that file, in the file, it stored the source and the target, right? It stored the options. It stored all of the individual skip items, right? So what this is really useful for is that, quite often when you're doing deployments, perhaps you're doing deployments across environments, it's always the same things that you want to skip. It's always the same options that you want to apply. It's always the same policies that you want to apply. And you don't want to have a manual step where you need to remember to skip a table, otherwise you're going to blow the partitions, right? You want to have it as automated as possible. So having done this, I'm now in exactly the same state that I was in before I saved it. So I can now reopen this. And this is what some people would do in BISM Normalizer here. Like you can save the comparison to a file, and like have a file for each environment or whatever you want to do, right? You can be creative and store the comparison in a file and minimize the manual intervention. It's not like as minimized as an automated CI/CD build, but you can still minimize it in a low code, no code guided visual experience for deployment. And as I said earlier, even if you are doing it the traditional way with CI/CD, you still want to use it for different merge across repos and branches and bug fix branches and things like that. Okay, so I think that's about it in terms of my demo. As I'd already discussed with Chris and others, I was going to keep the demo fairly short so we could have time for Q&A. We can talk about ALM Toolkit, and we could even talk about other things if you're interested. So with that, I'll see if there's any questions. Hello, Chris. You on mute? Okay.
And there are problems with update meshes with the KPI setting. And he's referring to Visual Studio. And then this normalizer gives an error by updating. The only way to solve the problem is to give the measure a new name and create the KPI. And then his question is this still a problem with ALM Toolkit?
Okay, so I believe that that was a bug that was introduced actually to do with calculation groups. I believe it's fixed in the latest versions of both ALM Toolkit and BISM Normalizer. If you have any further issues, what you can do is you can come to here and you say report an issue, and you can create one of these. I do monitor these. You can see like I respond to all of these. Like you can see, I've basically wrote an essay for this guy. So if you have any issues, just this is the Analysis Services Git repo, the Microsoft one, and this is where the code base is stored. And so you can raise an issue here, and I'll get to it. But I'm about 95% sure that that bug that was just referred to is fixed in both of the both ALM Toolkit and the BISM Normalizer. In fact, there might even be an item here about it. I can't find it now, but okay, it might it might be this one. I'm not sure. No, okay, no problem. Okay, so yeah, I believe that's fixed. So if you find that it's not fixed, then please come and raise an issue here.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
We're also having questions. One question, for example, from Rene Behrens, and he's asking, can you compare M code as well with ALM Toolkit?
Yeah, so you can compare M code if it is in the dataset metadata definition, right? So, example, in this one, if I'm going to show all the objects, and then so this is an M expression, right? And so you can see the M expression here, and here it covers all that. This is an M parameter, and if I come to a table, you can come down and see the M expression for the partition for the table. So yes, it actually includes the M expression dependency tree. So as part of the validation. So yes, you can use it to compare M as long as it's in the data set. It doesn't cover M in data flows, for example. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Then we have a question from Paul, and Paul is asking, given the latest lakehouse movements, will Databricks SQL Analytics be supported as a data source for Azure Analysis Services and Power BI Premium? Or any suggestions for sourcing Azure Analysis Services from the Delta Lake?
Okay, so it will certainly be supported in Power BI. Now, there's some data sources that are not supported in Analysis Services that like ADLS Gen 2 and others. Eventually, we're figuring out how best to do, because at the moment we're focusing on getting Analysis Services parity in Power BI and making, with Gen 2 and Premium per user, it will become more viable for for users to go to Power BI. So we want to make at the moment, XMLA is going to GA in a couple of weeks. Large models is going to GA in a couple of weeks as well. And actually, while I'm on this topic, I'm just going to quickly show you, this is how you'll be able to set the default large models storage format. And the reason I'm raising this is that this actually works very well with XMLA. You're going to get much faster write operations, including from ALM Toolkit, if the data sets are stored in large models format, because if it's not in large models format, Power BI will generate an ABF backup in the background just for a simple transaction like redefining the definition of a measure. That with Analysis Services is like sub-second, and it is in Power BI as well, as long as you have this large model storage format. Otherwise, especially for something like over a gigabyte in size, it can take a while. So you would probably, if you're using ALM Toolkit, you need to enable XMLA write, and you should also probably enable this large model storage format. So anyway, I'm going off on a tangent, but I'll come back to the precise question about the data sources. So we are focusing on bringing parity to the Analysis Services parity to make Power BI a true superset. So we'll have XMLA GA, we'll have large models GA. We just announced OLS is going to ship by February. We're working on backup restore and the REST API for asynchronous refresh. They'll both land around the spring. All right. So we're focusing on that right now. And then we're going to figure out, how best to make it efficient to bring additional capabilities to Analysis Services customers. We haven't forgotten Analysis Services. We're just focusing. We find it more productive to focus on each semester. We've got like the goals that we want to achieve, and we have to focus. Otherwise, we don't end up achieving anything. So that's what we're focusing on at the moment. We're focusing on Analysis Services in Power BI and the big data story with Synapse and automated aggregations. So that's what we're focusing on at the moment. And then shortly thereafter, we will refocus and figure out a good story for the feature gap that is growing with Analysis Services, right? Because it's more than just the extra data sources, by the way. There's a ton of other things in Power BI. There's, aggregations, there's incremental refresh, there's, tighter security with BYOK, and VNets are going to launch soon. Then you've got the Azure Data Catalog integration that's going to launch very soon. You've got the Synapse integration. You've got the Microsoft Information Protection that you can put on a data set. There's a ton of extra things that you get in Power BI. It's not just the data sources. So we're going to figure. We're at the moment we're focusing on the Analysis Services parity in Power BI, and then we'll figure out exactly how to bring the rest of those features to Analysis Services customers in a way that works for Analysis Services customers. So the short answer is I'm sorry, but we will get to it as soon as we can.
Yeah. Thank you, Christian. We also have a question from Martin, and then it's a question regarding to Excel. So he says Power BI originated in Excel, and now Excel seems to have become more of a reporting client for Power BI rather than a standalone BI tool. And then new data modeling features come to Power BI, but not to Power Pivot. And then he says, how do you see the future of Excel related to Power BI?
Okay, so there's multiple things in Excel, right? There's the pivot table, and then there's the Power Pivot. So I think for the Power Pivot piece, we're kind of pivoting towards putting the model in desktop or as a Power BI data set. But certainly for the pivot table, there's a ton of new enhancements that are coming out there. And even things that are not in the pivot table, just like this kind of strong typing of objects based on CDM to say that this is a customer entity, and you can dynamically figure out what all the extra columns are, and the discoverability based on shared and certified data sets. When creating a new pivot table, you connect to Power BI, you get the same connection experience that if I say get data from Power BI data set, I'm presented with the certified and promoted data sets. And then the inheritance of the Microsoft Information Protection labels, all of that is integrating into Excel, right? Even when you create a brand new pivot table against a data set in Power BI, it will inherit the Microsoft Information Protection sensitivity labels, which means it's governed by Microsoft Cloud App Security policies, etc. So there's a ton of investment that we're doing in Excel. and we see Excel as, Excel will always be there. Excel will always have high usage. It just solves a slightly different use case of data analysis. Just like Word and PowerPoint and Excel serve different purposes. Excel pivot tables serve a slightly different purpose to Power BI rich visualizations that are highly customizable and with lots of additional functionality. But certainly in terms, I know that I've gone off on a tangent, as I sometimes do. I know the original question was more around the data model in Excel as part of Power Pivot. I think I'm not saying for sure, but I'm not anticipating any significant enhancements in that area. It'll still be there as an option, but most of the Excel focus is more around the pivot table consumption from Power BI.
Okay, thank you. We have also a question from Jos, and then he asks, when should I deploy a new model in SQL Server Analysis Services or Power BI Premium?
Okay, well, it depends really on what your organization's kind of organizational objectives are, and whether you are ready to re-platform your BI architecture to the cloud, or whether you're adding new functionality to the system, maybe a good opportunity, whether you've got like an organizational directive to start moving to the cloud, and then you want to re-platform. And you can also move to the cloud using the new virtual machines that we just launched that have pre-configured analysis services on them. So it really depends on the individual state of the organization. We put a ton of features like calculation groups into SQL Server Analysis Services 2019. We'll plan to do that in the next version of Analysis Services as well. We will continue to add new features to SQL Server Analysis Services. However, I mean, it's no secret that the future is in the cloud. So honestly, a lot of the investment that we put in the cloud can then be trickled down to SQL Server Analysis Services, like the new modeling features and things like that. So it's a difficult question to answer because it just depends on how comfortable each organization is with the cloud and how aggressive they are in terms of re-platform and reinvesting to modernize their BI architectures to harvest the benefits of the cloud. So it's not really a one-size-fits-all answer to that question, I'm afraid.
Yeah. Let me see what a good next question will be. Someone is asking advice regards maintaining an enterprise tabular model, and then they're asking, is it in Visual Studio or Power BI Desktop? And yeah, maybe even Tabular Editor as well, which will be coming up because we have a session in 3 weeks' time with Daniel. But then, what's your advice there? Like, how should you maintain the tabular model?
Okay, so I mean, we're putting more and more of the enterprise features into Power BI Desktop. The modeling view is really good I love the modeling view in Power BI Desktop. There's many things that just work really nicely in Power BI Desktop, but it doesn't let you, check the model into source control. Technically you could use ALM Toolkit to dump the output into a BIM file, but then you can't get that back into Power BI Desktop, right? So that's the advantage of SSDT and Tabular Editor. There's also the mode where you can use Tabular Editor to enhance the Power BI Desktop file. So I know we're planning on cleaning this up, to have more of a consolidated experience. It's not going to happen in the next, before the spring or so. We're gonna start doubling down on this at some point in the next calendar year. But yeah, I mean, for now, it really depends on the requirements. Is integration with source control a showstopper? Then go with either Tabular Editor or SSDT. And if you want the really kind of premium modeling experience that you get in Power BI Desktop, then you can go with Power BI Desktop. And there is some level of bridging the gap between the two. Like you can definitely take a Power BI Desktop model and you can migrate it over to Tabular Editor and manage it in Tabular Editor. Today, you can't, for example, take an SSDT model and get that into Power BI Desktop. You can't, for example, download to PBIT from a SSDT model that's deployed to the service. We'd like to do that one day. We're not there yet. So we'll start focus on interoperability between the tools and then start consolidating. But yeah, we're just not there yet. We're just, we're coming from this place where, we're moving, it's part of this migration from on-prem to the cloud. We've got a lot of legacy modeling tooling out there that in time we will consolidate, but we just have some work to do there.
Yeah. When you were just showing off the ALM Toolkit tool, you have the source and the destination. And yeah. I was wondering, for the source, would you also support the folder functionality from Tabular Editor? So the save to folder, is that something that's supported at the moment?
Not at the moment. So you're talking about the one where Tabular Editor breaks out the bin file into a bunch of separate files, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, it doesn't support that at this time. It could quite easily do that. So if I keep hearing requests for that, I could quite easily add that. It's certainly and actually I've that was something that Daniel expressed interest in as well. Eventually we could even converge our tools maybe one day. So at the moment the file-based access is limited to PBIT and bin files. So it doesn't support the case where there's a ton of files on the file system yet.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, let me see. I have a question from Peter. He's asking, how can you reuse definitions in the ALM Toolkit?
So reuse definitions as in, like, I've got a customer dimension that's a conform dimension. I want to reuse that definition across different tabular models. Is that? Do you think that's what he means?
Yeah, probably. I think so. That's
okay.
the only way how I can interpret it as well.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, so I mean, basically, you can have your target be a model, a separate model, like in SSDT. Getting tables and stuff into the Power BI Desktop model is limited, like I said earlier, because Power BI Desktop only supports certain metadata operations. And when you're doing a schema diff, if your source is Power BI Desktop, it's okay. But if the target is Power BI Desktop, there's only certain metadata operations you can actually perform. So you can't create a new customer dimension table. You can certainly bring in measures. So, if you're migrating from SSDT to Power BI Desktop, you wouldn't be able to create the tables, but you could use ALM Toolkit to bring in the measures, for example. So you can reuse the object definitions just by picking them up and putting them in another model or in another bin file or something like that, if that makes sense, right? So certainly in the SSDT world with the open metadata format, you can reuse objects very easily across models.
Yeah, no, thank you very much.
Okay.
Let's see if we can pick a final question. I think we're running almost out of time. I think you have your next meeting coming up as well, right?
Yeah. You know what my meeting is? I need to try and buy my son an Xbox on Walmart because they're going to have some available in 5 minutes.
Oh, cool.
So that's what my next meeting is. Yeah.
Okay. Let's pick the final question. He says, how does ALM Toolkit compare to Power BI deployment pipelines, since they both seem to be premium features?
Yeah, so they're both premium features. They are actually conceptually quite similar, right? They're both going to do a diff between the source and the target. So the deployment pipelines shows dev, test, and production. So there's two diffs, right? One between dev and test, one between test and production. But conceptually, they're very, very similar. They're both you can use them both in a kind of, so deployment pipelines is what we'd call like a low code, no code experience. And you can use ALM Toolkit in that kind of scenario. You can pick and choose objects that you want to deploy. So you can be very selective about what you deploy. It does a validation to ensure the integrity. So in deployment pipelines, it won't let you deploy a report that depends on a data set that doesn't exist. The primary difference is that ALM Toolkit is a lot more granular, right? It's a lot low. You're talking about measures and relationships and individual objects like M parameters and individual model properties and things like that. Whereas and one day I've even talked to the team that built. Can you still hear me? I think I just stopped.
Yes, I can.
Okay. Yeah, okay. So I even talked to the team that built deployment pipelines, because one day we could just add some little ellipsis to the row that is the difference, showing you that you've got a difference between two data sets, and it could launch into the ALM Toolkit experience, because like I said earlier, it's TypeScript, Chromium hosted, and it could be hosted in the browser. And one day we may well do that. And if you guys want that, you can ask for it, and that would increase the probability that that happens, right? So it very much fits the same paradigm. It's just a lower grain, and one day maybe it will even be integrated. Who knows?
Cool. Yeah. All right, then Chris, I want to thank you very, very much for your precious time.
Thank you so much, Chris. Thank you, everyone.
And we really hope that once the COVID pandemic is over, that you're very welcome to come to the Netherlands. We would love to meet you here. And I'm sure also the rest of the Dutch community. So we cannot wait. Yeah, so now all the best, and see you next time.
Thank you very much, Chris. Thank you very much, everyone. Really appreciate it. And hopefully we'll see each other in person soon. Thank you. Take care.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.